Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Dr. Burton and I are here, and we are talking about supporting anxiety and depression. And this episode is going to be a little bit different because we're going to talk about how to help someone who has anxiety and depression. So if you are someone's support system, some tools, some tips, and I think one of the big things we're also going to talk about is encouraging someone to seek help. What I would like to do today is I'm going to start out with some statistics from the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. So the first one, anxiety disorders are the most common mental illness in the US, affecting 40 million adults in the United States, age 18 and older, or 18.1% of the population every year. Anxiety disorders are highly treatable, yet only 36.9% of those suffering receive treatment. So those are pretty staggering numbers. And as we talked about before, those numbers have got to be much higher now that we're in the middle of this pandemic.
Right.
Thankfully, we're coming to an end. The end seems to be in sight, and hopefully, fingers crossed, everyone.
Well, I hope so, but you don't know.
Right. And anything could happen. I mean, who knows? This thing may not be over yet, but it looks like it is, and we're all really optimistic that it could be. And we talked about on previous episodes that, Mark, your clientele has certainly increased a lot over the last year.
Yes. In all the years we've been doing this, we've never been as busy as we are now. And it is about the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And what happened is, at least in Utah, there was a lockdown. And so, the number of people we were seeing in the office is certainly down. As soon as that lockdown was taken away, it just exploded. And, the thing I wanted to say about anxiety, and you're right, very few people seek treatment specifically for anxiety. And I see a fair number of couples in my practice. Almost all the time, there's an element of anxiety for one or both of the people. And it's one of the things that causes the relationship issues. So a lot of people don't even, for some reason, don't think about anxiety. They know they call it stress. So, which for me, it's synonymous. They say, okay, I'm stressed, but they don't think about doing anything about it until they then come sit on my couch. And often they're there in the context of a couple. And I will certainly do an assessment on what I call anxiety and point it out to them. And it's like they haven't thought of it in that particular way.
Mm-hmm. And I believe it was in last episode, you talked about mental health being, I think you called it a continuum. And and so, I mean, I think you can feel in general just anxious. And I think certainly a lot of people have felt anxiety over what's going on. And so we've talked about this before. We have what's called situational anxiety or situational depression. And then you have people who experience it on a regular basis where it feels like it almost controls their life. So before we jump into that, let me take a minute and read one more statistic from the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. So depression occurs more often in women than men. Some differences in the manner in which the depressed mood manifests have been found based on sex and age. In men, it manifests often as tiredness, irritability, and anger. They may show more reckless behavior and abuse drugs and alcohol. They also tend to not recognize that they are depressed and fail to seek help. In women, depression tends to manifest as sadness, worthlessness, and guilt. And I think these things tie in to anxiety as well, and what we're talking about in that there's situational anxiety and depression, and then there's anxiety and depression that's I've heard it referred to as chronic, where it ebbs and flows, it's up and down, but it's always there and it's always affecting your life in some way or another. And I think a lot of people are experiencing situational anxiety and depression with everything going on this year. And it's certainly good to seek treatment and to seek help when that's going on. But we also need to encourage those who have it long term, who are dealing with it just no matter what's going on in their life, no matter what's going on in the world.
Right. And, let me mention a couple of things about anxiety that I may have mentioned in our first episode. And that is that we are an anxious species. And so it's not like you can ever get rid of anxiety. You will always have a certain level of stress. And in some ways, it's the thing that helps us be productive. For example, if let's say you're in college and you have an exam coming up, if you're anxious, then that would generally cause you to study. If you aren't anxious or stressed about it, then you won't study and you probably won't do as well. Okay. So there's a curve, I think I mentioned before, that as anxiety goes up, your productivity tends to go up as well until you hit this point where the anxiety is too much and your productivity takes a nosedive and you become very ineffective. The other thing that I was thinking, how men typically, I think men aren't that self-aware of our internal emotional state. And I think mostly that's a cultural thing, that we don't really raise men to be self-aware. But anxiety, I think often, or they call it stress, right? So most of the men who come in to my office are saying that they're stressed, and it's generally stressed about work. They almost wear it as a badge of honor that they stress. And then the same thing happens with lack of sleep, which I think we've talked about. If I'm only getting 4 hours of sleep, well, that's pretty cool, because now I'm working, 12 hours a day. And again, it's that badge of honor, but lack of sleep makes everything worse. It makes anxiety worse, and it makes depression worse. And then the other common theme that I've mentioned before about depression is that sense that either part or all of your life is somehow out of your control. So if you think about it in terms of the pandemic in the last year, one, the anxiety makes sense because we're worried, are we going to get sick? And again, that anxiety, as you mentioned, Liz, exists on a continuum. And so for some people, they aren't, for whatever reason, they aren't worried very much at all. And for some people, they won't leave their house. And we've seen, they have their groceries delivered, they haven't left their house in a year. And for those people, the anxiety, the worry about getting sick is really big. Well, if you go to that thing I said about depression, all or part of your life is out of your control, that makes sense too, because we can't control this.
Yes.
Right? What we can do is we can wear masks, we can stay in our house, but you can't control what's happening outside. And so it leads to, and our normal schedule has been disrupted. I've seen this in a lot of people that, when it started a year ago in March, and I think people were saying, oh, this will go away by summer. So what I was seeing is people go, okay, well, I can handle this for a month or two or three. And here we are, last October and November, it's still going on. And that's when people hit what I call that COVID wall. And they hadn't really adjusted their lives. They were in a waiting mode to, let's wait until this ends, and then we'll go out and resume our life, when really what they needed to do is figure out, how do you adjust your life so that you can be somewhat active and be out and still be safe? And which I think you can do personally. I mean, I've done that with my family. But so that's why I think certainly in the last year, anxiety and depression has gone up a lot. It's a lot the pandemic.
Right. And like you said, we can't control this pandemic at all. There's no way to control biology, which is this boils down to, is we can't control the spread. We can't control, and we also can't control other people as well. And I think that's caused a lot of anxiety for people as they've watched people be reckless or not take enough care for others.
Yeah.
I think that's also hard. for people as well. And I remember when this pandemic first hit and they said lockdown for 2 weeks. And I said, okay, I can
do that.
Yeah, I can lock down for 2 weeks.
No
okay,
problem.
Sure. I don't like it because personally, I'm an extrovert and I live for social interaction. I live for people. And then they said, yeah, no, you need to keep social distancing for like a while. And that hit me hard. And I was genuinely depressed about it for a while because I couldn't be around my social circle. And the isolation was the hardest part for me. And it was just so tough. And it still is tough because.
You bring up a really good point, Liz. I think extroverts have had a much harder time at this.
Really
now,
have.
I'm an introvert. And so I've been preparing all my life for this, and I've been doing just fine. But my daughter, my wife, they're extroverts, and the isolation is really, really tough.
Yeah.
But here's an interesting thing about anxiety that my wife, around the pandemic, that my wife and I were talking about this morning. So a lot of they're doing a pretty good job of vaccinations here in Utah. Like yesterday, I think they did 40,000 a day, which is really,
that's great.
Really phenomenal. So a lot of our clients are getting vaccinated, and the CDC says if you have a group that's vaccinated, then you can be careful and you can be there without masks. My wife wanted to bring a group that she's been having back in person, and a lot of people are really resistant, even though the science says they can and they're vaccinated. It's that fear for some people, again, is pretty big, even though they should be safe. So
and which makes sense because we've been in survival mode for the last year. So many people, and I think it's hard to come out of that. And someone who has anxiety for literally a year, you have been told, and it has just been constantly in your face. If you get this, you could die. And that's certainly not exactly true, but you know that you can get sick. And that's all we've heard about is all of these hospitalizations and people are dying. And this is a dangerous disease. There's, there's no getting around that. And so how do you come down from that? And how do you go back into the world without feeling like you're going to die? Because
it's going to be hard.
Yeah, because people who have severe anxiety, that's what they're dealing with. And that's been their reality for the last year. So let's take a second, and I want to read another statistic. And this is from Mental Health America. The number of people looking for help with anxiety and depression has skyrocketed. From January to September 2020, 315,220 people took the anxiety screen, a 93% increase over the 2019 total number of anxiety screens. 534,784 people took the depression screen, a 62% increase over the 2019 total number of depression screens. So it makes sense that anxiety is more prevalent than depression because, again, the big underlying fact of this pandemic is we can't control it. And that's so hard for someone with anxiety. And I felt that myself in dealing with anxiety, in that when you feel like you can't control things, it just messes with your mind and you start creating rules for yourself, and you try to gain control in whatever way you can.
Right. And that, that's depressing. But one of the side effects of all those numbers, I really believe those numbers, is that there probably aren't enough mental health providers, or there probably, maybe more specifically, there aren't enough mental health providers on certain insurance panels in order to help the necessary people, or the people who are wanting treatment. Because I turn away 2 or 3 every day just from our group, because we can't take anyone else. And so that's I'm hearing that's pretty common for people. So all of a sudden, there are people who want to get help, want to get treatment. They're looking for people on their insurance panel, and they aren't there. And so there is a real need for people to find good mental health practitioners on their panels, and it's not happening.
So let's talk about then, let's say a really close friend or even a spouse or, a partner, someone you're living with comes to you and says, I'm feeling so anxious and I'm feeling so depressed and I don't know what to do. I don't know how to handle this anymore. What do you say to them? How could you help them if you're not a professional psychologist?
So let's divide this into two main areas. Let's call it physical, what you can do physically for them, what you can do emotionally for them. Mm-hmm. And as far as the physical, we've talked, I think I labeled it last time, the big three, as far as, meditation, exercise, and good sleep. And so the research as far as, I think for both depression and anxiety, helping you to move is really one of the most important things a person can do. Mm-hmm. But it's also, if you've ever been depressed, it's the thing that you don't want to do, depending on the severity of your depression. So I think from a physical standpoint, I'll call it gentle nudging, but gentle nudging to just move. And I don't know that I would call it exercise in the way that I was describing exercise previously, like good aerobic exercise.
Right.
Because I think just getting out and walking is really important. And so that would be the first thing. If you've got someone who really is sedentary because of the depression, then I think just to say, hey, I'm going to go on a walk around the block and I'd love for you to come with me. Mm-hmm. So you don't want to put any pressure on them. I mean, you would know, the amount of pressure you could put on a spouse or a friend, but I think that gentle nudging, but just movement. So walking, hiking, or maybe even yoga, because yoga tends to be pretty gentle. And you can say, hey, I'm going to throw out my yoga mat right here and do something. I'd love for you to do that with me. Now, the other thing I've mentioned is being connected with nature, even just sitting in nature alone or with someone else, is incredibly healing. And again, the research is pretty clear on that. But again, the person may need help getting to go outside. Let's go outside and just sit in the backyard, or let's, if you live in a large city, then finding that nature is more difficult. Although even, I don't know New York City very well, but, I hear about Central Park. I think it's a big park.
Yeah.
And so even just say, let's walk down to the park and sit on a bench. So, it's not that you need to go down to the park and walk all around, but sitting in the greenery, there's something about that is really helpful. So that would be, as far as the physical part, gentle nudging to help the person get moving.
And now, what would you say to someone who is terrified to leave their home because of COVID? And how do you help that person get out and move? And I know that has more to do with anxiety rather than depression, but they're often correlating. I mean, they often go hand in hand.
Yes.
So how do you help someone who's just too terrified to leave their house?
Well, again, I think, it's going to tie into my next part, which is the emotional and how you talk to them. But I think that there are ways to create that safety and to be, and again, Salt Lake and the surrounding mountains are what I know best. And I know that you can find a place where you can walk without a lot of people. And so you can, you take your masks and you can take the masks off when there's no one around. But I think I would guess even in a large park, I know Golden Gate Park in San Francisco pretty well. And there are so many areas in that park where you can be alone, even in a city of millions and millions of people. Because I've been there when the park has been crowded, but there are areas where you can walk. So I think it's just being creative, which is, again, what I've told couples and individuals. You need to start thinking outside the box. What can I do to get outside and be safe? Now, you may not be able to walk out your front door and down the block, but get in your car and drive somewhere and get to an area. People, like, again, in Utah, love the Red Rock area down south. It's this vast area where there isn't anyone. And just being outside. So be creative about it. That's what I would say about them.
Okay. Yeah.
So on an emotional standpoint, which is where I put, it's listening. People might say, well, how do I talk to someone who's depressed or anxious? I think the key is listening. Now, the what we all want, especially with a loved one, is to try and solve their problems. See, if the person is anxious or the person is depressed, then I'm going to tell you what you should do in order to change it. That just isn't going to work very well. That's not what the person needs. And so there are these three things that I think are really important. The first one is listening and understanding. And I think as far as communication goes, I think one of the best things you can do for someone who's anxious or depressed is to listen to them and to try and understand it. Now, the second piece is what I call validation. A lot of people stay away from validation because they assume it means I agree with you, when really what validation is, I can see it from your perspective. See, I think what we want more than anything, especially when we're struggling, say, with that anxiety or depression, is for someone to see us, to see what we're dealing with and to understand it. And so I don't necessarily need to agree with you about what it is you're experiencing, but I can say I can understand it to the point where I can say I get it from your perspective, and that makes sense to me. Now, in this, the third step is empathy, and for me, often that validation and empathy are really tightly bound together. But I still like to separate them. And so the empathy is to try and put yourself in the other person's emotional space, whether it's anxiety. Like, you may feel safe going outside. You may feel safe going to the grocery store, but your partner or the person, your spouse, may not feel safe.
Yeah.
And to be able to put yourself in that place to say, okay, I get it, how you don't feel safe. Because the worst thing I think we can do is say, come on, get over it. Let's go. It's not that helpful. And then what happens is they just feel like, okay, there's something wrong with me because I'm not, the extrovert like you are. I'm more of an introvert. And so I think that validation and the empathy is really critical in giving that emotional support.
Yeah, I've been in situations where I've been talking to a friend who's opened up to me and telling me about their problems, and I so desperately would love to take away their pain. And I'm thinking in my head, what can I do to help fix this person's problem? And I have to remind myself, well, it's not about me. I don't need to fix them. I need to listen. And I think listening is often one of the most valuable things you can do for someone.
It is. And I think we all want to take away someone else's pain, especially if we're close to that person. I think there's an additional component, and that might be that for a lot of us, it's uncomfortable to hear someone else's pain and sadness. It's uncomfortable to sit with sadness with someone else who is sad or depressed or anxious. And so I think getting used to the idea that I will sit with you through this difficult time is really important, and to really step away from, trying to solve the problem. So there's actually a great YouTube video I'm going to mention. It's called It's Not About the Nail. Now, and the reason I'm saying that is it gives a pretty good example of how it's a couple, and it's how you can step back from solving the problem. It's funny. It's made to be humorous, but it's called It's Not About the Nail. And it really explains this idea of just listening and understanding. Now, there's a fourth step that you may or may not use. And that fourth step would be some sort of solution. And so I think you have to, after you've let the person know that you see their hurt and their pain and that you understand it, then if it's appropriate, and you're going to have to know this by your relationship with either your spouse or a friend, you might be able to ask, okay, what can we do about this? And so you throw it out there. Now, and there may not be anything, and the person may say, oh, there's nothing we can do about it. And then I'd leave it. But if the person says to you, what do you think I can do about it? What they've done is they've just given you an invitation to enter their process. And I would not enter their process unless you're invited, where they say, well, I don't know, what shall we do about it? But there are some people who are certainly going to be open to talking about things that you can do, and some people won't. But I think the only way you find that out is to throw it out there. Once you've really done those first three steps, I would not go to that fourth step of solution at all
Okay.
Until you really feel like you get it and the other person senses that you get it.
Okay.
Here's the last thing. I think there is a lot of good evidence that the way that just the process of smiling changes the way we feel over time.
Okay.
So now there's going to be some resistance to doing this, but there have been some studies where they've asked people to study. I think I'm going to grab a pen because I think I'm putting the pen in my mouth right now, but if you clench the pen in your mouth, it can mimic the same muscle movement that comes from smiling. But I think even better is sit down and watch a funny movie and laughing. Now it's going to seem, like that is the last thing this person is going to want to do, but maybe that's exactly what they had to do with you. Hey, let's watch this, this movie that we laughed at. But again, you're going to have to make that judgment call based on how well you know that person. So that's not something I would do with everybody.
Right.
But you could certainly have it, say, in your little toolbox to pull out. If you know the person might laugh at something, then, maybe it's not a full movie. YouTube has so many funny videos.
Funny animal videos.
Yeah.
Those are great. I mean, have you ever walked away from watching a funny animal video on YouTube feeling depressed?
See, that way they're usually short, right?
Yeah.
So you can say, hey, and that you may not even have to say to the person, hey, let's go watch a video. You can, because I'm doing this all the time with my wife. I'm pulling up something and say, hey, have you seen this? And so it's like I'm watching it and I say, hey, I want to share this with you.
Yeah.
So it could be that. So it happens more naturally, more organically, that you try and help the other person laugh. And at first they may not laugh. I still think
that's okay.
It's worth it. Yeah, it's worth it. I wouldn't give up on doing that.
Okay, great. So we've talked about before that telling an anxious person to just calm down
does not work.
Doesn't help. Right.
No.
So how do we help someone who's just feeling really anxious? What can we do to help that person?
And I have such a terrible memory myself. I can't remember what we talked about in past episodes, but breathing. It's about breathing. And if you take any type of meditative practice or yoga, in fact, there will always be a component of breathing. And it's really important to distinguish between what I call shallow breathing and deep breathing. Now, often in my office, I'll say to someone, okay, take a deep breath in there. And what they do is they take this incredibly big shallow breath, which is when your chest moves. And so a deep breath is what I call a diaphragm breath, or your stomach is going out. Now that's not really what's happening because there's no air in your stomach like that, but your diaphragm is pushing it out. And so shallow is a chest breath. And when we're stressed, I would say the vast majority of time you're having a shallow breath. And I'll have people in my office, I'll just say, show me how you're breathing. I have them put a hand on their chest and a hand on their stomach, and I watch it. And so one of the quickest ways you can help someone calm down is to help them change their breath to a deep breath. Because again, that physiological reaction that we have to stress or anxiety causes us to breathe in a shallow manner. And it takes some practice. But I think people can learn how to breathe deeply. Now, if you've ever been a singer, or I think a woodwind player, I think you, or maybe a sax player or something, you have to know how to do that very deep breath. And those people can actually do it pretty well because they've practiced.
And I imagine
so breath is it.
Yeah. And I imagine you could find a YouTube video on what
breathing.
Exactly it is.
Sure,
yeah,
I'm sure
there's tons of them. So you can
there's a YouTube video for everything, right?
There really is these days.
Yeah.
So now going back to depression. So if you're with someone and they just feel really down, what's the best way to talk to them? Let's say they don't want to solve their problems. Maybe they just, I don't know, what's the best way to talk to them?
So I think that, the real stigma attached to any mental health issues. So depression is one of those mental health issues, that people don't want to be depressed. They don't want to feel depressed. And I think that's the reason why people generally don't seek treatment very often with this. But I think you can start off by calling it sadness.
Okay.
I think, you can say, you look sad to me. I'm wondering if you're feeling sad and what that's about. So just noticing them, but not saying, oh, you look really anxious or you look really depressed.
Okay.
I would soften it up. Now, if they tend to use those words, then you can use those words. But for most people, we are okay being sad every once in a while. And it could, and if they use the term sadness, I would just stick with the term sadness. I wouldn't use depression. I'd just go with whatever word. If they would prefer stressed over anxiety, I'd use stressed over anxiety with them rather than, use the words that they use. But I think the way in is to notice and then to make it be soft, a soft entry, which is more, you look sad. I'm wondering, if you want to talk about what you're sad about. That's how it would get into it.
Okay. And I want to also take a minute to talk about, if you are the person who is someone's support system, make time for yourself too, if you can. And boundaries, I think, could be really important, because I think it can be really hard to live with someone who has that, because as we know, with someone who has anxiety and depression, it's hard to live with, but it's also hard to be the support system, because in a sense you're taking that on. And I think it's very easy to become burdened. So what advice would you give to someone who just feels burdened?
Well, it's that caregiver burnout, which I think we've mentioned before. And so boundaries, really important. One of my favorite words, creating boundaries so for instance, if the person doesn't want to go out walking with you, you don't change your exercise routine. You don't change, you getting out. You still have to live your life, and you don't have to live the same life that your spouse is living. And so that's the boundary, is what I would call that. But I think the understanding of, I can live my life, and ultimately it's this other person's responsibility to, I wasn't going to say solve it, but to, do something that would help it to get out. It's ultimately their responsibility. Now you can be there as a help. It's not my job to help this other person get outside. I can gentle nudge, as I said, but otherwise, if they aren't going outside, then I'm going to go anyway. Okay.
Yeah. You can't help someone who doesn't want to be helped.
No. And ultimately it's their choice.
Right. Okay. So thanks everyone for tuning in to us. Next week, we are going to talk about obsessive compulsive disorder. So be sure to tune in for that. Thanks everyone.
Have a great week.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.